Dr. Aries Thorne stood on the shattered earth of her inheritance, the foreclosure notice a brittle white scar in her hand. This paper gave her 30 days. 30 days until the Thorne family name was scraped off this valley for good. Before her, 60 acres of cracked caliche clay baked under the Wyoming sun, a hardpan desert that hadn't produced a viable crop in 3 years. Behind her, the farmhouse where her father, William, was wasting away, a man hollowed out by debt and dust. The number on the notice was $75,000, an impossible sum in 1888, a figure designed not to be repaid but to crush. Lurking just beyond the horizon of the debt was the real threat, Marcus Thorne, the railroad baron who shared their name but none of their blood, a predator who used banks like Abernathy Financial as his hunting dogs. He wanted this land not for what it could grow, but for the straight, flat path it would cut for his steel rails heading west. The entire town of Redemption knew it. They whispered it in the general store, their pity a sharper insult than scorn. They had already written the obituary for the Thorne Ranch. And they had laughed, a low, rumbling chuckle of rural certainty, when they heard what the educated doctor from back east, the grieving widow with dirt under her nails, planned to do about it. She was going to plant flowers. Sunflowers. This is not the story of a farm's gentle decline. This is the story of its defense. It is a story of scientific warfare waged with seeds and soil, of a woman who weaponized botany against the crushing force of corporate greed. It is the story of how one season of defiant, golden blooms broke a conspiracy that ran from the local bank all the way to the state capitol, and how, in saving her own land, Aries Thorne gave an entire community back its future. This is how you fight a war when your only weapon is the earth itself. The fight began not with a bang, but with the quiet, suffocating scent of failure. Aries had returned from Boston 2 months prior, the black fabric of her mourning clothes still stiff and unfamiliar. Her husband's death from influenza had been a sharp, clinical blow, but the state of her family's ranch was a slow, creeping gangrene. She had left a home of green pastures and fat cattle, she returned to a bone yard. The land was sick. A concrete-like layer of caliche, once a manageable subsurface nuisance, had become an impenetrable shield just inches below the topsoil, choking roots and shedding what little rain fell. William Thorne, a man once as solid as the granite peaks that framed the valley, was now a ghost haunting his own home. He sat at the kitchen table, his hands, once capable of mending any fence and calming any beast, now trembling as he stared at the first notice from Abernathy Financial. "It's the blight," he'd rasped, his voice thin as burlap. "Came on 3 years back. Nothing grows. The soil's gone sour." Cursed Aries, her botanist's mind rejecting superstition, walked the fields. She didn't see a curse, she saw a system in catastrophic failure. She saw compacted soil, zero water penetration, and nutrient lockdown. She took samples, crumbling the lifeless grey dirt in her palm. Back in the study, using the brass microscope she'd brought with her, she saw not plague, but poverty. The microscopic life that gave soil its richness was gone. It was sterile. Starved. That night, she sat with her father, the lamplight carving deep shadows into his face. She pushed aside the foreclosure letter. "It's not a curse, Father. It's a physical problem. It's called hardpan." Caliche consolidation. He just shook his head, the gesture weary and final. "Call it what you will, Aries. The bank calls it default." The letter was brutally clear. The loan, taken out to purchase a new bull and expand their herd 2 years before the blight, had ballooned with interest. Abernathy, the bank's owner, had been patient at first, then predatory. Now, he was moving in for the kill. "Mr. Thorne has offered to clear the debt," William said, the words tasting like ash. "Marcus Thorne." Aries felt a cold spike of fury. "He wants to buy our failure for pennies so he can lay his track across our history. He's offering us a way out," William countered, his voice lacking any conviction. "It's a cage, not a door," she shot back, her voice low and tight. "We don't need an offer. We need a harvest." William let out a dry, humorless laugh. "A harvest of what?" "Dust." That was the moment the siege truly began. Aries looked at her father's defeated face, at the legal document that was a death warrant for their legacy, and the grief she carried for her husband fused with a cold, righteous anger. She was a scientist. A problem was not a curse, it was a set of variables to be solved. The land wasn't dead. It was dormant. And she knew exactly how to wake it up. The answer was not in her father's worn agricultural almanacs, filled with generational wisdom about crop rotation and cattle bloodlines. It was in her own trunk, in the dense, technical journals from her studies in Boston. She spent 2 days locked in the study, papers spread across the floor, cross-referencing soil composition reports from the U.S. Geological Survey with her own microscopic analysis. She mapped the 60 acres of blighted pasture, noting the depth of the caliche, which ranged from 6 inches to nearly 2 feet. No plow could break it. Dynamite would be too expensive and would shatter the fragile topsoil. The solution couldn't come from above, it had to come from within. She found it in a German study on phytoremediation, the use of deep-rooted plants to decontaminate or restructure soil. The paper detailed a specific genus, Helianthus. The sunflower. Not the ornamental varieties from eastern gardens, but their wild, powerful ancestors. She found the specific cultivar she needed in a seed catalog from a specialist grower in St. Louis, Helianthus annuus titan, a Russian mammoth variety prized not for its beauty, but for its aggression. Its single, massive taproot was a biological drill, capable of burrowing 20 feet or more in search of water, exerting hundreds of pounds of pressure per square inch as it grew. It would pulverize the caliche from below. As it died, the decaying root system would create channels for water and air, depositing organic matter deep into the sterile subsoil. It was a living plow. The seeds produced were also rich in high-quality oil, a premium cash crop if the harvest was successful. It was a perfect, elegant, biological machine. She brought the plan to her father. She laid out the diagrams, the scientific papers, the catalog page. "We're going to plant 60 acres of these," she announced, her finger tapping the drawing of the sunflower's formidable root structure. William stared, uncomprehending. He looked from the technical drawings to his daughter's determined face. "Flowers." The word was heavy with disbelief. "We're fighting for our lives and you want to plant flowers." "It's not about the flowers, father. It's about the roots," she explained, her voice gaining the patient, precise tone of a lecturer. "The taproots will act like drills. They will break through the hard pan. They will draw up water and nutrients that have been locked away for years. They will aerate the soil. They are the only tool we have that can fix this land from the inside out. Then, we harvest the seeds. The oil is worth a fortune." He shook his head, rubbing his temples. "Aries, we are ranchers. The Thorns have run cattle on this land for 50 years. People will laugh us out of the valley. Let them laugh," she said, her voice dropping, cold and final. "I need you to sell the last 4 cows. All of them. I need the money for the seed." The request hung in the air between them. Selling the last of the herd was not just a financial decision, it was an act of surrender, an admission that the Thorn Ranch was no longer a ranch. It was the end of an era. For a long moment, William just looked at her, his eyes clouded with doubt. Then, a tiny flicker of his old self returned, a spark of the man who had once gambled on a new bull, on a bigger dream. He looked at the desperation on the foreclosure notice, then at the fierce, unyielding certainty in his daughter's eyes. He gave a slow, tired nod. "All right, doctor," he said, the title both a jab and a concession. "You'll have your seeds." The laughter started the day Aries went to the bank. She didn't go to beg, but to inform. She presented herself at the polished oak desk of Mr. Abernathy, a man whose tailored suits were an affront to the dusty town. He was Marcus Thorne's man, a fact everyone knew and no one spoke aloud. She requested a 30-day extension on the initial payment, not a forgiveness of the debt. "On what grounds?" Abernathy asked, his smile thin and condescending. He steepled his fingers, peering at her over the top of his spectacles. "I am planting a cash crop," Aries stated, her tone level. The 60 acres of fallow pasture. Abernathy leaned back, a look of genuine amusement spreading across his face. "My dear Dr. Thorne, that land is worthless. Nothing has grown there in 3 years. What miracle do you intend to plant?" "Helianthus annuus," she said, refusing to simplify. Abernathy blinked. "Sunflowers," she clarified, a sharp edge to her voice. The banker's feigned composure broke. He let out a short, barking laugh. He quickly stifled it, but the contempt lingered in his eyes. "You intend to pay a $75,000 debt by planting a garden," he sneered. "The extension is denied. The terms of the loan are absolute. I suggest you take Mr. Thorne's generous offer while it still stands." "I will not," Ari said, her voice like ice. She turned and walked out, the sound of Abernathy's quiet chuckle following her into the street. The story spread through Redemption like a grass fire. By afternoon, the mockery was public. As she loaded supplies into her wagon at the general store, a group of ranchers watched from the porch. Their leader, a burly man named Peterson whose land bordered hers, called out, his voice loud enough for the whole street to hear. "Heard you're trading cows for poses, Doc. Gonna make a big bouquet for the banker." His cronies roared with laughter. Aries ignored them, securing a final sack of flour. Peterson wasn't just a neighbor, he was a man who stood to gain if the railroad came through, having already signed a lucrative access agreement with Marcus Thorne. "Don't you worry," another man yelled. "When Marcus Thorne owns that land, he'll put it to good use. We need that rail spur." Aries finished her work, climbed into the wagon seat, and gathered the reins. She looked directly at Peterson, her gaze unwavering. She said nothing. The silence was more potent than any retort. She snapped the reins, and the wagon lurched forward, leaving them in a cloud of dust and derision. Even her own cousin, Daniel, who worked as a clerk for Marcus Thorne's local logistics office, came to her under the guise of concern. "Aries, people are talking," he said, shifting his feet nervously in the farmyard. "They think you've lost your senses. Maybe you should just consider the offer." "It's good money, or it's blood money, Daniel," she replied, turning her back on him to unload her supplies. The ridicule solidified her resolve. It was fuel. Let them laugh. Their laughter was the sound of ignorance, the chorus of men who saw a field of flowers instead of a weapon. They saw a grieving widow playing in the dirt. They had no idea they were watching a scientist prepare her battlefield. The planting was back-breaking work. With the last of the cattle money, she'd bought the seeds and hired 2 laborers from the next town over, men who didn't care what they were planting as long as they were paid. Using a modified seed drill, they painstakingly sowed the 60 acres, the machine groaning as it scratched a shallow furrow in the hard-baked earth. It was a gamble on a scale no one could comprehend. 60 acres of hope, planted in a graveyard. For 2 weeks, nothing happened. The field remained a barren expanse of grey-brown dirt. The whispers in town grew louder. Abernathy sent a polite, cruel letter reminding her that the seizure date was approaching. William spent most of his days staring out the window, his silence a heavy blanket over the house. Aries, however, was patient. She walked the fields every dawn, not looking for sprouts, but checking the soil's moisture, feeling for the subtle changes the town's mockers couldn't see. Then, it began. A faint green haze appeared across the furrows. Tiny, paired leaves pushed their way through the crusty soil, delicate but fierce. Within a week, the field was covered in a carpet of determined seedlings. The sight brought a fragile hope back into her father's eyes. "They're growing," he murmured, standing beside her at the edge of the field, the sunset turning the tiny leaves to silver. "Of course they are," Aries said. Their work is just beginning. She had jury-rigged an irrigation system, diverting water from a small creek at the far end of their property. A series of shallow ditches carried the precious water to the thirsty seedlings. It was inefficient but vital. One morning, she went out to check the main ditch and found it dry. The seedlings in the westernmost quadrant of the field were already beginning to wilt under the morning sun. She followed the ditch back to its source. Halfway there, she found the problem. A 20-foot section of the earthen bank had been deliberately collapsed. The cuts were clean, made with a sharp spade, not the result of natural erosion. A cold dread washed over her. This wasn't a random act of vandalism. It was targeted. As she stood over the ruined ditch, her eyes caught a glimmer in the dirt nearby. A scattering of white, crystalline powder. She knelt, touching it. It was gritty, like coarse salt. She tasted a tiny amount on her fingertip. It was saline, but with a bitter, chemical undertone. Not just salt. Something industrial. Someone had not only cut off the water but had also tried to poison the soil itself. She looked back at the struggling seedlings, their leaves curling in on themselves. This was sabotage. The laughter had stopped. The real fight had begun. She spent the rest of the day with the two laborers, frantically digging a bypass channel. They worked with a desperate urgency, the sun beating down on them. By evening, water was once again flowing to the damaged section, but the poison was already in the soil. Aries filled a small glass jar with the contaminated dirt and the white powder. She took it back to her study, to her microscope. This was no longer just an agricultural problem. It was a crime scene. The attack escalated the stakes from a battle against nature and finance to a war against a hidden enemy. Marcus Thorne, she knew, never got his own hands dirty. He used proxies. Men like Abernathy. Men like Peterson. Maybe even men like her cousin, Daniel. She stared out at the field, now a patchwork of healthy green and wilting yellow. The saboteur had been precise, targeting the area furthest from the house, the section least likely to be checked regularly. They were watching her. They knew her routines. The feeling of being watched, of an unseen enemy moving against her in the dark, was more terrifying than any bank notice. The sabotage was a grievous blow. The seedlings in the poisoned western quadrant withered, their leaves turning a sickly, mottled brown. Aries tried to flush the soil with fresh water, but the chemical agent, whatever it was persistent. 10 acres of her 60-acre gamble were turning to dust. The loss was demoralizing, but the attack on the rest of the field had an unexpected consequence. It forced the surviving plants to work harder. Their roots, sensing the surface-level stress, began their deep dive with even greater urgency, a desperate search for survival. But the enemy wasn't finished. 2 weeks later, at the most critical stage of the sunflower's growth, when the stalks were thickening and the nascent heads were beginning to form, the second attack came. The steam-powered pump that drew water from the main well for the house and the emergency reserve for the field sputtered and died. William, who knew its rhythms better than his own heartbeat, went to check on it. He came back pale, his hands trembling with rage. "It's the main drive gear," he said, his voice a low growl. "Stripped clean." Someone took a file to it. He held up the heavy iron gear. The teeth were mangled, chewed down to smooth, useless nubs. It wasn't wear and tear, it was deliberate, malicious destruction. A replacement would have to be ordered from Cheyenne, a week's journey at best. They had 2 days of water in the cistern. The fields would be dead long before then. It was a checkmate. That same afternoon, as if on cue, a buggy crested the hill. Mr. Abernathy sat beside the county sheriff. They didn't come to the door. They stopped at the fence line, and the sheriff, a man who had known William for 30 years, began nailing a large, official-looking document to the main gatepost. A writ of seizure. The final notice. The date of foreclosure was set for 1 week from today. Abernathy watched from the buggy, his expression a mask of detached professionalism. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, then the buggy turned and disappeared. The sight broke William Thorne. He stumbled back from the window, collapsing into his chair at the kitchen table. He put his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking. "It's over, Aries," he whispered, the words choked with defeat. "They've beaten us." Aries stood frozen, the stripped gear heavy in her hand, the sheriff's hammer blows echoing like nails in a coffin. Everything was gone. The water, the time, the hope. She looked out at the field of green stalks, their heads just beginning to track the sun, and felt a despair so profound it was like drowning. The laughter of the ranchers, the smirk on Abernathy's face, the shadow of Marcus Thorne, they had won. The 60 acres were silent, the only sound the rustle of leaves in a dry wind. For the first time since returning home, Aries believed her father was right. It was over. The sun began to set, casting long, mournful shadows across the field. She walked out into the dying light, not to the house, but to the poison quadrant, the graveyard of her initial hopes. She walked until she stood in the center of the devastation, surrounded by the ghosts of what might have been. The rage had cooled to a cold, hard knot in her stomach. It was in that moment of absolute defeat that the scientist in her took over one last time. She didn't know why she did it. Perhaps it was a refusal to accept the finality of the nail in the gatepost. Perhaps it was a scientist's instinct to perform one last act of data collection before abandoning the experiment. With a small spade she carried, she began to dig at the base of one of the few surviving sunflowers in the blighted section, a stunted, pathetic thing, but a survivor nonetheless. The topsoil was dry and brittle. A few inches down, her spade hit the familiar, unforgiving thud of the caliche hardpan. This was the wall. The end of everything. Defeated, she dropped to her knees. She ran her hand over the smooth, concrete-like surface. But then her fingers brushed against something. A tiny fissure. A hairline crack radiating out from the base of the sunflower's stalk. Following it with her fingers, she found the root. It had not been stopped. It had squeezed into the crack, a living wedge. Driven by a desperate, renewed energy, she dug around it, scraping away the hardpan with the edge of her spade. The work was brutal. The clay was like stone. But she followed the stubborn brown thread of the root deeper and deeper. 1 inch. 3 inches. 6. Then, with a final, scraping effort, her spade broke through. The sound was a dull pop. A pocket of cool, damp air rose to meet her. She reached into the hole her hand had made, past the layer of caliche. Her fingers sank into soil that was cool, moist, and dark. It was the earth as it was meant to be, rich with the smell of life. The root had done it. The sunflower's taproot had drilled through the impenetrable barrier and had reached a deep, isolated water table, a reservoir of moisture the surface drought and sabotage could not touch. She looked up from the hole, her gaze sweeping across the entire 60-acre field. They weren't dying. They weren't even just surviving. The plants in the main field, the ones untouched by the chemical agent, were thriving. Their deep green color and thick stalks weren't a fluke. They had all done it. They had bypassed her failing irrigation system entirely. They had found their own water. They had liberated themselves. A wild, fierce joy surged through her, so potent it almost brought her to her knees. They hadn't beaten her. They had underestimated her weapon. She ran back to the house, her heart pounding. She grabbed the jar of contaminated soil from her study and the ruined gear from the pump. She knew what the chemical was now, or at least, what it wasn't. It wasn't simple salt. On her microscope slide, the crystals were too uniform, too manufactured. It was an industrial byproduct, something that would come from a railroad or a mine, not a farm. She had the proof of the attack. And now, she had proof of the solution. The sunflowers were their own salvation. The game wasn't over. A new one had just begun. The bank had declared war with a legal document. She would answer with one of her own. The next morning, Aries did not ride into redemption defeated. She rode in armed. Dressed not in a farmer's work clothes but in the same severe, black dress she'd worn to the bank before, she bypassed Abernathy Financial completely. Her destination was the county courthouse. In her satchel, she carried 3 pieces of evidence: the jar of contaminated soil with its crystalline poison, the stripped and filed pump gear, and her father's original loan document. She also carried a small, heavy box. Inside was the Kodak camera she had bought in Boston, a piece of technology few in Redemption had ever seen. The night before, by lamplight, she had taken a stark, clear photograph of the mangled gear. Evidence that could be seen and understood by anyone. She found Judge Miller, a man known more for his pragmatism than his legal brilliance, holding court in his chambers. She laid her evidence on his desk. Abernathy was already there, expecting to finalize the paperwork for the seizure. He looked up, his expression of surprise quickly hardening into annoyance. "Dr. Thorne," the judge said, peering at her over his spectacles. "Mr. Abernathy is just filing the final transfer of title." "I'm afraid you're too late. On the contrary, Your Honor," Ari said, her voice ringing with clarity in the quiet room. "I am here to file for an injunction to halt this seizure, pending a criminal investigation." Abernathy scoffed. "On what absurd grounds?" Aries ignored him, her attention fixed on the judge. She unrolled the loan document, its pages worn and folded. She pointed to a dense paragraph of fine print on the third page. "Clause 17b, Your Honor. The force majeure clause. It states that all repayment obligations are temporarily suspended in the event of acts of God or of malicious interference by a third party that materially impacts the asset's productivity." She then placed the jar of soil on the desk. "This is a soil sample from my western pasture. It has been deliberately poisoned with a chemical agent." She placed the ruined gear beside it. "This is the main drive gear from my water pump. It was destroyed by a hand file 2 days ago." Finally, she laid the photograph on top. "And this is proof of that destruction." Judge Miller stared at the assembled evidence. He picked up the gear, running a thumb over the smoothed-off teeth. He looked at the photograph, then at the jar of white powder. The air in the room grew thick. Abernathy, for the first time, looked unsettled. "This is a baseless accusation," he sputtered. "A desperate fantasy to delay the inevitable." "Is it?" Ariz's voice was cold steel. "The agent used to poison my land is not common salt. My analysis shows it to be a refined industrial byproduct. And the sabotage to my pump occurred the very day you arrived to serve the final notice. It's a remarkable coincidence, Mr. Abernathy." The judge looked from Ariz's fierce, unwavering gaze to Abernathy's suddenly sweating brow. He was a town judge, not a fool. He understood the power dynamics of the valley. He knew who Abernathy worked for, and he knew Marcus Thorne's reputation. "An injunction," he said slowly, testing the word. "Based on this, you are alleging a criminal conspiracy to force your default." "I am not alleging it, Your Honor," Aries corrected him. "I am presenting preliminary evidence of it. And under the terms of the contract Mr. Abernathy himself drafted, this evidence requires him to stand down." The banker was trapped. Humiliated by the very document he had used as a weapon. The fine print he had counted on her never reading was now her shield. Judge Miller picked up his gavel. "Mr. Abernathy, the writ of seizure is stayed. I am granting a temporary injunction for 30 days, pending an investigation by the sheriff into these allegations of sabotage." He brought the gavel down. The sound was a thunderclap. Aries had won the battle. But as she walked out of the courthouse, leaving a stunned and furious Abernathy in her wake, she knew the war was about to escalate dramatically. Marcus Thorne would not be defeated by a small-town judge. He would now bring the full weight of his power to bear. The injunction bought Aries 30 precious days. In that time, the sunflowers transformed. Having tapped into the deep water table, they exploded with growth. The stalks thickened to the width of a man's wrist and soared to 8, then 10, then 12 feet high. The 60-acre field became a dense, towering forest of green, each stalk crowned with a heavy, drooping head that turned in unison to follow the sun's arc across the sky. The sight was breathtaking, a defiant statement of life that silenced the town's remaining mockers. But Aries knew her victory was fragile. Marcus Thorne's countermove came not with thugs in the night, but with the quiet, inexorable power of the state. A polished black buggy, bearing the official seal of the Wyoming Territorial Agricultural Commission, rolled up to her farm. Out stepped a man named Davies, the state inspector. He was everything Abernathy was not: calm, polite, and exuding an aura of unimpeachable authority. His voice was flat and nasal, the sound of bureaucracy itself. "Dr. Thorne," he began, with a thin, professional smile. "We've received an anonymous report of a potential agricultural contagion in this valley. A novel form of stem rot that specifically targets the Helianthus genus. He didn't need to say who sent the report. Aries knew. My crop is perfectly healthy, Inspector, she said, her body forming a barrier in front of her field. I'm sure it is, Davies said smoothly. This is just a precaution. A simple inspection to ensure the safety of the entire region. His inspection was a farce. He walked along the edge of the field, barely glancing at the towering stalks. He took a single soil sample from the area she had already identified as poisoned. His testing kit, which he set up on a small table, produced results with theatrical speed. After 15 minutes of fiddling with vials and colored liquids, he looked up, his face a mask of grave concern. I'm afraid it's just as we feared, he announced, his voice carrying the weight of a death sentence. The soil shows clear markers of Sclerotinia sclerotiorum, but a highly aggressive, previously undocumented strain. Your crop is contaminated. He held up a vial of murky purple liquid as if it were gospel. I have no choice but to declare this property under full quarantine. Nothing leaves these fences. The crop cannot be harvested or sold. It must be burned to prevent a territory-wide outbreak. Before Aries could even protest, his assistant was unrolling spools of bright red tape and tacking signs to her fence posts. Quarantine, by order of the Territorial Agricultural Commission. No trespassing. The red tape was a visual shriek. It was a prison wall built of paper and lies. This was a far more sophisticated attack than a broken pump. Sabotage could be proven in a local court. But how could she fight a state-level quarantine backed by falsified scientific data? Davies was a bureaucratic ghost, untouchable. His weapon was not a spade, but a clipboard. He had the law, the state, and a fabricated plague on his side. He had, in one swift, legal move, sentenced her record-breaking crop to death by fire. As Davies's buggy departed, leaving Aries surrounded by the red banners of her defeat, she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. She was isolated, legally gagged, and her triumphant harvest was now worthless, a 60-acre bonfire waiting to happen. Marcus Thorne had checkmated her once again, this time using the very language of science she revered. Desperation forged Aries's final, most audacious plan. She had one last move, a long shot that depended on a force more powerful than Marcus Thorne's money, academic integrity. She sent a telegram, not to a lawyer, but to her former mentor at Boston University, Dr. Lena Petrova. Petrova was a titan in the field of botany, a Russian émigré whose work on soil science was legendary. Her name carried unimpeachable authority. The telegram was simple: fraudulent quarantine. Need independent verification. My life's work at stake. A week later, Dr. Petrova arrived on the Cheyenne train, a small, fierce woman with eyes that missed nothing. She listened to Aries's story without interruption, her expression grim. She brought her own advanced testing equipment, a mobile laboratory in a series of polished brass and mahogany cases. For 2 days, the two women worked, taking samples from every quadrant of the field, running meticulous, replicable tests. The results were unequivocal. There is no novel blight, Petrova declared, her voice precise and laced with cold fury as she reviewed the final assay. There is no Sclerotinia outbreak. The only anomaly is this industrial contaminant in the western quadrant, a zinc sulfate compound, commonly used as a wood preservative for railroad ties, the smoking gun. Just as Petrova was documenting her findings, 2 buggies approached. The first carried Inspector Davies, come to oversee the preparations for the burning. The second, lagging behind, was unexpected. A lone figure sat hunched in the driver's seat. It was her cousin, Daniel. He looked gaunt, terrified. Davies strode forward, oozing authority. Dr. Thorne, I trust you're ready to comply. The burn is scheduled for tomorrow at dawn. Your quarantine is a fraud, Inspector, Aries said, stepping forward. Dr. Petrova stood beside her, a silent, formidable presence. This is Dr. Lena Petrova of Boston University. Her tests show this crop is clean. Davies's composure cracked. He paled at the mention of Petrova's name. This is a territorial matter, her credentials are not recognized here. As he stammered, Daniel stumbled out of his buggy. He couldn't look Aries in the eye. He thrust a heavy leather-bound ledger into her hands. "I'm sorry, Aries," he choked out, the words ripped from him. I couldn't let them burn it." He had been the inside man. He had provided the information on the pump. But the finality of the burn had broken him. The ledger contained everything. It was Marcus Thorne's private account book for the Redemption Acquisition Project. It detailed the payments to Abernathy for applying pressure, the purchase of the zinc sulfate, the bonus paid to a hired man for the sabotage, and a line item for state inspection facilitation, a direct payment to Davies. It even included a letter from Thorne outlining the entire strategy: devalue the land through a manufactured blight, force a foreclosure, and acquire the property for the rail spur at a fraction of its worth. It was a complete, documented confession of the conspiracy. When Davies saw the ledger in Aris's hands, all the air went out of him. He tried to run, but William, stronger than he'd been in years, blocked his path. The confrontation was over. The evidence was absolute. Armed with Petrova's report and the ledger, Aris had the quarantine lifted by sunset. A federal marshal, summoned by telegram from Cheyenne, placed a stunned Inspector Davies under arrest and issued a warrant for the chief conspirator, Marcus Thorne. The news of the railroad baron's impending indictment sent shockwaves through the territory. The siege was broken. The harvest that followed was the stuff of legend. The sunflowers, having drunk deep from the earth, produced heads heavy with seeds of unparalleled size and oil content. The yield was astronomical. The sale of the oil and seeds didn't just clear the $75,000 debt, it brought in nearly double that amount. The Thorne Ranch was saved. But the story didn't end there. The true victory wasn't financial, it was agricultural. The decaying roots of the great sunflowers had done their work, shattering the hardpan and infusing the dead soil with life. The following spring, the 60 acres were planted with wheat, which grew with a vigor the valley hadn't seen in a generation. The ranchers who had mocked Doc Thorne's flower patch came to her, hats in hand, asking for her knowledge, for her seeds. Peterson, his deal with the disgraced railroad evaporated, was first in line. Aris didn't gloat. She taught. She established the Redemption Valley Seed Cooperative, using the profits from her harvest to build a shared silo and provide local farmers with access to the resilient Titan seeds and the science of phytoremediation. The final scene of the war was not in a courtroom, but on a bright autumn day a year later. Aris stood on a platform before the new, gleaming co-op silo, built on the very land Marcus Thorne had tried to steal. Her father stood beside her, his back straight, his eyes clear and proud. The whole valley was there. Aris held a pair of shears. She looked out at the faces of her neighbors, once mockers, now partners. "They say you can't fight progress," she said, her voice carrying over the crowd. "But what we learned is that you must define what progress is. It is not a steel track laid over a dead field. It is the land itself, made healthy and whole. It is a community, working together. This is our ground. We decide what grows here." She leaned forward and cut the ceremonial red ribbon. The snip of the shears was clean, sharp, and final. It was the sound of victory.